The mob, organized crime, has been a force in Hollywood almost since the advent of talking pictures. The mob was already in Hollywood. Everybody knew it, certainly the Justice Department did. But it wasn't until just a few years ago that any real effort was made to prove it.
Hey, what's up, guys? Thanks for checking out American Made. Today, we have a really interesting guest that I look forward to speaking with. My guest served in the FBI for 26 years, working everything from organized crime, terrorism, and child exploitation cases. Much of his career in the FBI was spent undercover, posing as a drug dealer, a contract killer, and a weapons dealer, just to name a few. He's also the author of the book, The Last Undercover, detailing his FBI undercover career. My guest today is Bob Hamer. Bob, how are you doing, man? Thanks for being here.
Jesse, thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir. I'm glad to have you. You have so many different interesting stories throughout your career in the FBI, but before we get there, could you just tell us, a little bit about yourself, maybe a little bit about your childhood and where you're from?
Yeah, I grew up in the Midwest, went to college back there, joined the Marine Corps, spent 4 years on active duty in the Marine Corps, and then joined the FBI a long time ago. I'm as old as probably older than your father and older than most of your viewers. But yeah, so I spent 4 years on active duty in the Marines and then 26 years in the FBI. And as you mentioned, a lot of those FBI years were spent undercover. So I always said I had a great career. I'll match my career with anybody. It was fun. It was a roller coaster ride, but I enjoyed the undercover work. That's where I kind of shined, and I tried to gravitate toward that. So I was fortunate. Some of those assignments lasted a couple of days, some more than 3 years. So the goal was to have fun and get out of the office, and I managed to do that.
Right. You mentioned joining the FBI right out of the military. What led to your decision to apply for the FBI? I mean, did you have any family involved in law enforcement?
No, none at all. I think I probably just watched too much TV as a kid. I love the cops and robbers shows, and that's what I was interested in doing. And yeah, there was the TV show The FBI with Ephraim Zimbalist Jr., and I used to watch that and think, boy, this is really exciting, only to find out once I got in that there was no real inspector that had a different case every week. So my eyes were open pretty quickly once I got in the field. But yeah, I gravitated toward the Law and Order type of shows and the cop shows, the cops and robbers. It seemed exciting. It seemed like a good way to pay back this country for all that it had given me, and it was an exciting way to pay him back.
Now, how long before you started doing undercover work? And I mean, how does that happen? Is that something that you're approached about, or is that something that you seek out to start working undercover?
You know what? I was really fortunate. The whole program has changed. I mean, it changed while I was in the Bureau, but it's changed now where typically you have to be on active duty for 3 years before you can even apply to become an undercover agent. Jesse, it's not like TV. The supervisor doesn't walk into the squad bay and says, "Hey, who wants to be a contract killer today, or who wants to be a drug dealer?" In order to work undercover, you have to be certified. So that means that you apply. You go through a couple interview processes. There's a selection process. Then there's a school, and roughly only about half the agents that get accepted into the school then come out as certified undercover agents. There are probably 10,000 street agents in the FBI across the country, and maybe only 100 to 150 that are certified undercover agents. So not everybody wants to do undercover work. A lot of guys maybe do 1 or 2 assignments and then they don't want to do it anymore because of the danger, because of the stress, because of the impact it has on a family. But there were several of us that just loved the undercover work and gravitated toward it. And that's what I did. I was actually the undercover agent in 20 administratively approved operations. Now that was, like I said, those operations would last 6-month intervals. So, but I was in 20 of those undercover operations. So it was a great time. I enjoyed it. But kind of to get back to your question, it didn't start when I first started. I had only been in 6 months, and we had a case. The case kind of fell apart because it was a wiretap case, and it fell apart because of a problem with another law enforcement agency. And we went to the subject of our wiretap investigation, kind of fooled him into believing we were getting ready to indict him if he didn't cooperate. He agreed to cooperate and agreed to introduce an undercover agent. He looked at me and he said, "Hey, I'll take you in. You know, you fit the part." I think part of my back then, I didn't look like a cop. I didn't think like a cop. I didn't talk like a cop. So he even recognized this, that I hadn't been ingrained yet with all of the FBI lingo. And I still kind of had my, I guess my civilian aura that he liked. So yeah, within 6 months, I did my first undercover assignment, and that was great.
Yeah, I would imagine that first case that you worked was very nerve-wracking. Is that something that gets better the more undercover cases you're on, or are you always a little bit on edge with these investigations?
You know, I have to admit, the very first meeting I had with the main target of our investigation, and he was not Italian, but he worked for Joe Bonanno, who at that time was working out of Tucson. Dave, the target of our investigation, was one of the top residential burglars on the West Coast. And I mean, he would hit these highline art galleries, highline residents, and steal anything out of there, and always pay a piece back to Joe Bonanno to pay that street tax in order to operate. So I got introduced to him as somebody that had the money. I had a little bit of money, and I was interested in buying Western art. And we knew that was one of his specialties, was in Western art. But Jesse, my very first meeting with him, I went into that meeting and my knees were shaking. And it wasn't from fear, it was from adrenaline. And I prayed and I said, "God, don't let him see the knees, because he's going to know something's up." And I went into this meeting. It was a very innocuous meeting. There was no criminal conversation, but I came out of that with an adrenaline high. And I got to admit, I spent the rest of my career chasing that adrenaline dragon. I was looking for that excitement from the undercover. And sure, there were nerve-wracking times, but I just got into my character, and I love being somebody else. I like to joke that I never really had a midlife crisis. I just became somebody different. So it was great. And I didn't make that much money, but if I was going to be a high roller, I didn't have to go out and buy the Porsche. I could just get it from the undercover warehouse. So that made it nice too.
Right. You mentioned Joe Bonanno a second ago. I know you've worked a lot of different cases, taken down a lot of different criminal organizations. For a time, you worked the Los Angeles family of La Cosa Nostra, or the Mafia. Could you talk a little bit about that, if you recall anything about that?
Yeah, you're making me dig deep into my memory. But, yeah, LA had a family. So in the 20s and 30s, when bootlegging was big, Jack Dragna was the head of the family. He actually was considered to be a pretty major player, known by everybody on the East Coast. It's my understanding that he was directly represented on the commission. So Dragna had the family in the 20s and 30s. After World War II, you start to see like the Bugsy Siegels and the Mickey Cohens move out to Los Angeles, and I'm sure your viewers are familiar with those names.
Mm-hmm.
Bugsy Siegel was active in Las Vegas and in the movie industry. Mickey Cohen was the same way. So, and they of course were Jewish rather than Italian, but they were working with the Italians and the Sicilians in Los Angeles. Then in the mid 50s, Frank DeSimone was the head of the LA family. He actually was back in Appalachia in 1957 when they had the big raid there. So, I mean, the LA family was recognized back after DeSimone died. Nick Licata took over, and then he died in the early 70s. And it was Dominic Bruclier that took over the family then. Now, what was interesting, even as once I came on the scene, one of the top defense attorneys in Los Angeles was Bruclier's son. So he was a pretty well, actually respected criminal defense attorney. But Dominic Bruclier took over the family. Before I got to Los Angeles, LA had a sting operation, and it was called Pornex. One of the things that the mob guys were doing on the West Coast, they were shaking down bookmakers, loan sharks, and the porn industry. Most of the porn at that time that you were seeing, in the back rooms and the porn magazines and all that, they were coming out of Los Angeles. So the FBI set up a fake pornography studio, and that's when the mob essentially shook them down. And that was in the late 70s, when all those guys, essentially the top echelon of that family, were taken out and went to prison. So now, one of the guys that was not convicted in that case, it wasn't even charged, was a guy named Pete Milano. And Pete was a capo in the family. He was elevated to the boss of the family. He was from Cleveland. His dad was a made guy out of Cleveland. Pete had gravitated toward Los Angeles. He ran a vending machine company, and then, as I said, he became boss. He brought his brother Carmen, who was a disbarred attorney, to be the underboss. And so in the early 80s, they started running the family, and it was Pete who was given directions out of New York to, look, let's get these guys on the ball. I want you to start working. I want you to start building up the family. I want you to protect our interest in the movie industry. And that's what he did. And that's where I came in the early to mid 80s. I came in, obviously, by looking at me, I'm not Italian, so I wasn't coming in. I wasn't cruel enough to be a Joe Pistone, to act like I was an Italian that wanted to become a made guy. But my cover story was that I was a screenwriter, and that I was selling drugs in Hollywood, and I needed protection. And in order to operate, I had to pay a street tax back to the mob. So I got involved with a couple guys who became sources for the FBI, and they were going to Pete Milano, to Luigi Galfuso, who was one of the capos, and to a couple other guys, just to say, hey, we're shaking down this guy, Bobby. He's a screenwriter. He's selling drugs, and he's paying us $5,000 a month. So that's how I initially got introduced. What we ended up doing was we paid 1 or 2 months. So we made the $5,000 payment. We knew that the $1,000 was going to Pete Milano, the boss of the family, and $1,000 was going to Luigi Galfuso, the capo in the family. So we came up with a story that my drug dealer got busted. I was out of cocaine. Cocaine was big back then.
Mm-hmm.
I'm out of cocaine. So if you want to operate, I mean, if you want me to pay the street tax, I don't mind paying it, but I don't have any product to sell. So can you get me product? And they bid, introduced me to a guy named Johnny Vaccaro. Strangely enough, his daughter was not I don't think she was at that time, but at one point was married to Fred Dreyer, the actor in Hunter and the football player who played in the NFL.
Mm-hmm.
So Johnny Vaccaro, they fronted me a kilo of cocaine, which at that time was going for $30,000 a kilo. And we were very slow in paying. I mean, I told them I was piecing it out an ounce at a time. They had given me 3 weeks, but they real quickly, they started demanding money and threatening to beat me up and break my legs and all that, and gave us all the probable cause we needed to move forward and get that as part of a RICO indictment.
That's really interesting. You know, so much is known of the East Coast and the families in New York and on the East Coast, but you know, not as much is known about the Los Angeles family and families on the, you know, out West Coast. So how did that investigation conclude? You mentioned the boss and underboss and the administration of the family you was able to take down.
Yeah, we ended up convicting 15 members of the family and essentially wiping out the family. I mean, LA, even before, while this was going on, there were people coming from the outside, mob guys coming from the outside, trying to work in LA. And before Pete Milano took over, they were kind of operating independently. So we had a guy, Vito Spallone from Chicago. He moved out here and started shaking down the loan sharks at the card clubs. California has legalized gambling in card clubs, and so there would be loan sharks operating out of the card clubs. Well, Vito Spallone started shaking down those loan sharks and using members of the Aryan Brotherhood, a prison gang of white gang, prison gang members. When they got out, Vito was using them as collectors for his business. So that was kind of operating. But now, so we went after Vito, and we got Vito separate and apart from the Mafia family case. So we did have independent mob guys coming out here and operating, but we ended up taking out the family. Like I said, 15 people were convicted or pled guilty, and it essentially wiped out the mob. The family never quite recovered. I think when quite a few of them got out, they just left Los Angeles and moved to Vegas. You have to understand, one of the reasons that a big difference between the West Coast and the East Coast is in New York and Boston and New Jersey, some of those places, you actually have an Italian community. And we didn't have that in Los Angeles. There isn't a Little Italy in Los Angeles. Yeah, so we had, I guess you could call it organized crime. Mm-hmm. We had conspiracies that were ethnic conspiracies, but not Italian Cosa Nostra members that were working in Los Angeles, because there just wasn't a strong Italian family. Obviously, the Crips and the Bloods began in Los Angeles. MS-13 began in Los Angeles. We have a Russian community, so there were Russian mob guys. It's essentially a Jewish community, so we had Jewish mob guys. But you just can't look on the map and say, oh, here's Little Italy in Los Angeles. So let's set up our mob operations here and shake down all the Italian restaurant owners.
Right. You said you pretty much took down the whole family. Just out of curiosity, do you have any knowledge of that the family is still operating today?
No, I don't think they are. I think maybe there were one or two guys that tried to operate independently, but they just didn't have the strength. They didn't have the muscle that they needed. And there was the Organized Crime Strike Force, which was a Department of Justice initiative, a federal Department of Justice initiative. They did a great job. Jim Henderson was the head of that. He's now deceased, but he headed that up, and you had a strong organized crime officers from Los Angeles Police Department, from the Sheriff's Department, the District Attorney's Office. I mean, they kept on these guys. And, so they made life pretty unpleasant. And like I said, there wasn't that strong ethnic community to protect anybody. So if you got out of line, usually someone was willing to tell law enforcement about what they were doing. So you tried to shake down a bookmaker. I think about half the bookmakers in LA were informants for LAPD or the sheriff's office anyway. So you tried to shake them down, you were taking a chance that they were going to tell the local authorities. So.
Right. Yeah, I think a lot of, as you mentioned, a lot of different street gangs and stuff just became more prevalent and basically took over a lot of things going on the street.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I mean, and they couldn't. They seriously, they couldn't compare to what the Crips and the Bloods were doing, what MS-13 was doing in their particular neighborhoods. You had in LA, I mean, in California, you had 4 principal gangs. You had the Aryan Brotherhood, the Western Familia, the Black Guerrilla Family, and the Mexican Mafia. So when those guys were getting out of prison, they were coming back out on the street. There was no way that La Cosa Nostra was going to be able to compete with them.
Right. Now, I want to move on to another investigation that you were involved in, one that I found really, really interesting, Operation Smoking Dragon. And this involved Chinese organized crime, which I think is probably a much bigger threat these days than the Mafia here in America, at least. What exactly was Operation Smoking Dragon?
Yeah, certainly. And I agree with what you just said. Certainly, I think in the United States, particularly on the West Coast, Asian criminal syndicates are much more dangerous to our society than anything that the LCN or Sicilian Mafia can do. Operation Smoking Dragon began, and I have to admit, again, it comes down to I was a certified undercover agent, and I loved undercover work. So I like to joke that on the West Coast, there weren't too many of us certified. And toward the end of my career, I kind of got the IOU assignment. So if they wanted somebody that was impotent, old, or ugly, they were calling on me. So one of our great FBI agent, Omar Trevino, he was my case agent, but they had developed an informant who was talking about all the counterfeit cigarettes that were coming in through the Los Angeles and Long Beach ports. Now, the LA port is one of the largest ports in the world, and there are thousands and thousands of containers that were coming in. And the FBI knew that counterfeit cigarettes were coming in, and these cigarettes were made in North Korea and China, and they were coming into the United States, and then they were filtering down to mom and pop grocery stores, some of which were owned by Middle Easterners who were using the proceeds to fund terrorism. So in essence, the FBI looked at this snake, the head of the snake, the people that were bringing the counterfeit cigarettes in, and the tail of the snake, the mom and pop distributors that were using the proceeds to finance terrorism overseas. Fortunately for me, I got the head of this thing. And the informant, again, it's kind of like, hey, I bought a lot of drugs in South Central Los Angeles from Crip members. I'm dealing with the Italian mob in Los Angeles, and now we've got an Asian criminal syndicate, but they had more faith in an Anglo, in a white guy, than they did in another Asian. So the case agent contacted the undercover coordinator and said, "Hey, we essentially needed an older white guy, and who do you have that's available?" And I was available, so I got I was actually assigned to this case. I could not tell you who the informant is. I couldn't even pick him out of a lineup. I met him twice. He told me essentially what he thought that what we thought was our initial main subject, what he was looking for. His name was John Sito. Willem Seto was his Chinese name. I met with him, explained what I had available. I had a warehouse where they could store their counterfeit cigarettes. I had access to some long haul truck drivers, so I could probably help them transport their cigarettes across country. And maybe once a month, I had 3 guys that I knew that worked at the port. And maybe once a month, when all 3 of them working together, I could get their containers. So we started, I would charge them $60,000 for a container. They were investing roughly $250,000 into these counterfeit cigarettes. Now you got to understand, Jesse, that I'd worked a lot of drugs, a lot of cocaine and heroin, but the profits in counterfeit cigarettes were astronomical. So you take a pack of cigarettes, and these counterfeits, I could hold up a pack of Marlboros that were real and a pack of counterfeit Marlboros, and you couldn't tell the difference. The packaging was identical. The cartons were identical. The master cases were identical. The only difference was that the tobacco used in the cigarettes was grown either in China or North Korea. So a carton, 10 packs to a carton of cigarettes was going for maybe $7, $8, $9 a carton. And a pack of cigarettes was going for $5 on the West Coast. On the East Coast, it was going for $10 or $11. So you just do the math. Mm-hmm. The amount of profit that was made by moving these counterfeit cigarettes was just amazing. And when I first got approached by the case agent, hey, we're going after counterfeit cigarettes, I'm like, why are we doing this? I mean, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, why aren't they working this? And why are we doing it? But again, I wasn't going to complain because it meant I got out of the office. We started with the counterfeit cigarettes. John Seto, Willem Seto, he bought my act. Took him about a month that he brought a container to the warehouse, a 40-foot container, which had roughly 10 million cigarettes in there. He wanted them transported back to the East Coast to some Russian mob guys that he was dealing with. So we had one of our undercover agents transported the container back there. I met with 5 Russian mob guys, actually went to a safe house that the FBI didn't know about at the time. They knew about it after we went there, and watched their workers affix counterfeit New York tax stamps to these packs of cigarettes. So within this first month, we have the container safely delivered, nobody gets arrested, and now I'm kind of golden. They know that I was able to do what I said I was going to do. And that case just literally exploded. I mean, I started meeting more people. We moved from counterfeit cigarettes. The Russians contacted me because they had stolen cars and wanted to know if I wanted to buy stolen cars. Now I'm purchasing some stolen cars. We're involved in the counterfeit cigarettes. One of the females that I was dealing with brought me ecstasy. And I laugh because, like I said, purchased a ton of heroin and cocaine. I'd never seen ecstasy. So one of the keys when you're when you're undercover, if you're stupid, play stupid. I play stupid very well. And it was just, Jenny, what is this? I don't understand. What's ecstasy? So she explained it, how you ingest it, where it's manufactured, how they smuggle it in to the United States. And I said, well, let me check. I know a guy that owns a bar down in New Orleans. Let me see if he wants it. And I called my case agent and said, hey, do we want ecstasy? And he said, yeah, let's go ahead and buy ecstasy. So I got back in touch with her and started buying ecstasy. Well, then she brings me crystal meth, and it's the same thing. Let me check with my buddy down in New Orleans if he wants it. Call my case agent. Do we want crystal meth? Yep. Yeah, we'll take crystal meth. So this thing is moving. We're buying counterfeit clothing, counterfeit. They were counterfeiting Viagra from China. Oh, wow. And we weren't just buying blue pills in a plastic bag. This was in the actual pharmaceutical containers, all the instructions and all of that. And I was told that they were selling these large containers of Viagra to the online drug companies up in Canada. So when you're buying Viagra online out of Canada, you may be getting the real Viagra, or you may be getting an herbal counterfeit solution.
It's very interesting that they accepted you, being a white guy, being Caucasian, that they accepted you like that. I know you've mentioned before a lot of different cases. You would have a crutch with you. What was that about?
In this case, I ended up working 3 cases at one time. So I was working this Operation Smoking Dragon. I was working a Vietnamese gang case down in San Diego. And then I got involved in a case called NAMBLA, North American Man Boy Love Association. It's a group of men that are sexually attracted to boys. And when I first started that undercover, it's kind of a long story, but I just thought, man, I look too much like a cop. I smell like a cop. I need to sort of do something to make me seem a little less like law enforcement. And I'd been working a surveillance and was on the street. We were following a guy on the street, and I walked past the Salvation Army store and saw a walking stick in the window of the Salvation Army store, and it kind of dawned on me, you know what? Why don't I just pay handicap? And walked into the store and bought this walking stick. So I started using the walking stick, and then eventually an arm crutch in the NAMBLA case. And I kind of liked it. And okay, I got to admit, I can be somewhat lazy. If we were going to have a warehouse where they're bringing in master cases of counterfeit cigarettes, I didn't want to be unloading trucks. So I had a medical condition and wasn't going to be able to help with that. So so I used that crutch to my advantage, and it really worked out, because in terms of the Chinese, they just referred to me as the crippled round eye. How can he can't be in that community, at least in terms of Los Angeles. If you're a police officer, you're police. If you're plain clothes, you're FBI. So they don't really distinguish detectives or anything. But people would say to the different people, how can we trust him? He said, he crippled round eye. He's not FBI, he crippled round eye. Even there were guys in China. My reputation got to be so strong that there were guys in China that just knew who the crippled round eye was in Los Angeles, because we were rocking and rolling. What they didn't know was that a lot of these cigarettes weren't reaching their ultimate destination. So as an example, they would they'd bring the container to my warehouse. They'd send in box trucks to take off maybe 20, 40, 60 cases, and then they would take off and go to some other distributor. We'd contact the highway patrol, the local police, whatever. They would tail the truck. The truck would do a bad turn or have a missing tail light or something, pull them over, and then seize the cigarettes. One time there was a hole in the 60-foot container. I saw that. So I ended up putting a hose in the container and just flooding the container. So when we delivered the container to another warehouse in Los Angeles, and when they opened the doors, this water just comes pouring out. I mean, we ruined $250,000. They were mad. They were yelling at me, and
Yeah.
I pointed to the hole in the roof, and I said, "Yeah, this container was probably the top container on the boat, on the ship that came across, and there was probably a storm at sea. You know,
Yeah.
you guys made the container. I didn't. This is your container. Don't blame me." Now, they never tested the water to find out if it was salt water. But I'd say, you know, a lot of these cigarettes weren't getting through.
Yeah, I was curious as to how you prevented cigarettes and even some of these other products from getting out on the street like that. You know, even though they're just cigarettes, you know, there's no telling what's in those cigarettes. So I was
Well,
curious.
that's a good question, Jesse, because what we had to do, we had to take samples and send them to CDC, the Center for Disease Control. They would analyze the cigarettes and then get back to us and say, okay, these aren't any more carcinogenic than the ones we're selling in the United States. You have to understand that from the cigarette standpoint, these were good cigarettes. I mean, a lot of times it wasn't like they were making these cigarettes in the back room of somebody's house. This was a cigarette manufacturing company in China or North Korea that were doing North Korean or Chinese cigarettes. Well, then at the end of the work shift at night, they would make the counterfeit ones. So and strangely enough, I even talked to guys. We eventually, between what we did on the East Coast and the West Coast, we indicted 87 people, and I'll get into a little more detail. But, you know, I was talking to guys, and it was more prestigious to carry around a pack of Marlboros than it was some pack of Chinese brand cigarettes. But they preferred the Chinese tobacco to the American tobacco. So in some ways, they knew they were purchasing counterfeit cigarettes or counterfeit Marlboros, but they preferred the taste of the Chinese tobacco. So it wasn't like every consumer was getting screwed.
Right. Yeah, it seems like it started with the cigarettes, and it just kept this investigation kept folding into more and more counterfeit and even in drugs. And is that something that, you know, I'm sure is somewhat overwhelming. I mean, the investigation started off with cigarettes. Is that something that you're trying to do, is trying to expand it and continue to expand the investigation like that?
You know, we really weren't, in the sense that, like I said, initially our goal was just to identify how these cigarettes were coming into the port, who was distributing them, what was the network that was distributing them. Although I had money set aside in the undercover budget to purchase drugs, it was almost an afterthought. And it wasn't until the one female started bringing me the ecstasy and the crystal meth that we decided, okay, let's expand that. Obviously, when I was dealing with the Russians, they were the ones that brought up the stolen cars. So yeah, we'll take the stolen cars. That was never in the game plan, in the original operations order. Then I started to make so much money that it got to the point that we were just taking, rather than bringing me $60,000, just bring me a couple kilos of crystal meth of methamphetamines. And at one point, one of our main targets brought 2 kilos of methamphetamines, and it was the highest quality meth that the DEA lab in National City, California, which is where their big lab was on the West Coast. It was the highest quality crystal meth they'd ever seen. And I was told by my Chinese contact that it was made on a Chinese military base. And this is what they were giving to their pilots and their soldiers to stay awake. So now, I mean, we're expanding a little bit further. It's kind of funny. My case agent, like I said, Omar, was great. We had a very good relationship, and at one point he said, "Bob, we've got cigarettes, we've got counterfeit clothing, we've got counterfeit postage stamps." They were counterfeiting our postage stamps.
Mm. Wow.
We got counterfeit postage stamps, clothing, pharmaceuticals, Viagra. We need some guns to put on the press conference table, just to make this look like it's a really important case. And if you saw this in a movie, you wouldn't believe it, but this is true. I was with one of our main targets. We're driving down the Pomona Freeway, and I just turned to him. I'm driving, and I turned to him and I said, "Hey, one of my clients owns a PMC, a private military company down in Alabama. He gets hired out by these third world countries. Could you throw in a case of AK-47s in your next container of counterfeit cigarettes?" And just then, a National Guard flatbed truck went by with a tank on it. And he looks at me and he points. He goes, "I get your tank." He said, "I get you anything but nuclear weapons." So I just get shipped for drug dealers down in South America. And we're going, holy crap. I mean, all we wanted was like a 9mm to put on the press conference table. And next thing I know, he introduces me to a guy who's connected me with a couple Chinese generals, and we are negotiating a $60 million shoulder fire QW2 shoulder fire missile weapons. Mm. We had 20 containers of these weapons that were available for sale. It was illegal to sell the weapons in the United States, so we were going to have to pay off government officials in other countries in order to phony up the paperwork for us to get these missiles brought in directly to the United States. Now, we didn't go through with that because it was $60 million, but we had that conspiracy, and we were able to indict a couple of the guys for that, specifically for provisions out of the Patriot Act. So now it's like, my gosh, we're dealing with Chinese generals, we're dealing with more people. And North Korea did counterfeit our $100 bill. I'm not sure that they do anymore, but they counterfeit our $100 bill, and it's called the super note. Mm. I think it was Rush Hour 2. They talk about it in that movie. My case agent got a hold of me and he said, "Do you think you can get the super note?" And I said, "I don't know. I mean, I can try." And I made up a story that just doesn't really even make sense, but they bought it. And essentially I had real money tied up in safety deposit boxes that I used as escrow accounts. So if I were doing criminal activity, I could take you to my safety deposit box and show you $250,000 or $500,000 in cash that's in this safety deposit box. So by this time, I'm dealing with 5 different organizations under this umbrella organization. So I told 5 different people, I said, "Can you bring me the super note?" No, I mean, I didn't say super note. I said, "Can you bring me good quality counterfeit?" And as I'm sure you're aware, the Secret Service investigates counterfeit money. So the first $100 bill they brought me, because what my story was, look, I can invest this $500,000 or $250,000. I can make money with that. So I just need good quality counterfeit money in the safety deposit boxes so these people think that it's real money. And so the first $100 bill they brought me, Secret Service said, "No, this was made in Colombia. We've seen this before." One, they said, "This is made in Macau. We've seen this before." Another one said, "We haven't seen this before. It's not the super note." Well, then 2 different guys brought me the super note, and now we end up purchasing the cost of the super note was 35 cents on the dollar.
Mm.
Minimum purchase of $1 million worth of super notes. So we end up purchasing $1 million, $350,000 of the super note. Now, keep in mind, this 350,000 wasn't your tax dollars. This was the money I'd already made from the bad guys. So they were essentially financing their own undercover operation at this point. So we bought $350,000 of the super note. We knew when all the arrests were going to go down between what was being done on the East Coast and what was being done on the West Coast. So after we got that first $1 million delivery, we ordered up another $1 million order. And then right before the arrest went down, the guy that was representing North Korea came to the United States and met with me and told me that North Korea was going to give me $40 million a year in the super notes to launder here in the United States. So, which is really, I mean, this is part and parcel to why we have the new $100 bill, the one that came out a couple of years ago. That's Smoking Dragon in a nutshell. It started with counterfeit cigarettes and one guy. 3 years later, between Smoking Dragon and Royal Charm, we indict 87 people, and we get everything from the counterfeit cigarettes to shoulder fire missiles and super notes.
Yeah, I've heard you mention before that these notes were so good that they even fooled the Secret Service in Los Angeles. Is that?
Yeah. What had happened was when they first started manufacturing the bills, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing and Secret Service were putting out notices to the banks and to the merchants that, hey, Jussie is not on a $100 bill. It's Benjamin Franklin. So North Korea was getting these notices. So they kept correcting the plates, and they had the same printing press that we used. They ended up getting the same paper that we used. They were able to make, excuse me, by the end, as this case was wrapping up, there were 3 top secret marks on those bills that they weren't even telling their analysts out in the field because the information was leaking as to how to correct the marks on the bills. One of the guys we eventually convicted in Las Vegas, he had laundered close to $1 million through the slot machines in Las Vegas. I mean, the money was that good. Wow. With the naked eye, you couldn't tell the difference. It was near perfect.
Wow. If it got over on the Secret Service, yeah, they had to be really good notes. Now you mentioned there were 87 arrests. How did that takedown happen? Was it over? That's a lot of people. Was that over a period of time, or was it all on?
There were. I will correct it. There were 87 people indicted. I don't think all 87 were arrested. In fact, I think there's still fugitives out there, but I think we got like 70, 75. But yeah, it was over a 3-day weekend. So Operation Royal Charm, the guys that were working this case back on the East Coast, they set up a phony wedding, and a lot of the guys, the targets of their investigation, were invited to the wedding. So when they showed up, they were arrested. I just would set up meetings on the West Coast on Friday, Saturday, and Sundays, and I'd set up a meeting with 4 or 5 guys, and the FBI would come in and arrest all of us and take us away, and then kick me out the back door, and then I'd go meet with some other guys, and they'd arrest us again. So yeah, it was over a weekend.
Okay. Was there ever a moment where you were revealed to these bad guys, to these Chinese people, that you were revealed as an agent?
Oh yeah. And in all my cases, well, all but 2 cases, eventually the bad guys realized I was an undercover FBI agent. It didn't happen like in this case and in the NAMBLA case. It doesn't always happen right away. It may it may be a couple days, it may be a couple weeks before the defense counsel gets all the reports, but yeah, they all knew who I was at the end.
Okay. Just out of curiosity, if you had gotten gotten into any trouble at any point during this investigation or any investigation, what was the plan to, was there somebody always around you or near you? Did you have a wire on at the time? I mean, what was the plan if you was in any danger?
I mean, it depended on the situation, but typically, no, I was on my own.
Mm,
I would wear I would wear a recording device, but I almost never wore a transmitter just because on the recording devices they couldn't really be picked up by a device. The transmitters could be, so it was just a situation where it wasn't worth wearing the extra equipment that either could be discovered or could give off a signal that the bad guys could determine. Yeah, it wasn't TV. Most of
yeah.
the, I was almost always on my own. In I typically didn't even work with another agent. In the smoking dragon case, I did have a female agent that posed as my girlfriend
Hmm.
because one of the female targets, she kept coming on to me. So I needed a girlfriend, and I brought in another female agent as my girlfriend, and she was much prettier than anything I deserved, but she was a good sport. I guess because I had so much money, they kind of figured, oh, he's got enough money to entertain her. So
Yeah, it's a fascinating story, and you've had a fascinating career. Um, Before we wrap it up here, as I mentioned when we got started, you're an author of several books. What led you to become a writer?
when I retired, the NAMBLA case really bothered me, the North American Man Boy Love Association.
Hmm.
Like I said, a group of men that was sexually attracted to boys. And I just wanted to expose the organization and the whole boy lover agenda, and happened to meet a literary agent. And he said, he thought he could sell the book. So I wrote that first book, The Last Undercover. I have no skills. So in retirement, I tried writing, and I've written, depending on how you count, 11 books, but The Last Undercover is the true story of the NAMBLA investigation and a dozen other cases in which I was the undercover agent. Then I've written a couple of novels. And then I've written 3 books with Oliver North, New York Times bestselling author Oliver North. And
Hmm.
I've written a book for Tim Lee, who was a Marine who lost both legs in Vietnam and now is an evangelist and goes around telling his story to churches every Sunday. So I wrote a book with him, written a couple other books. I've got a book coming out. I wish were coming out right now since you're doing this, but I'm active in a group called Homes for Our Troops, and they build ADA homes for the combat wounded, so mostly double and triple amputees.
Mm.
And this is their 20th anniversary, so they've commissioned me to write about 21 of their recipients, and it's just the stories are amazing what these guys have done and overcome. I will be glad when that book comes out because I'll be very proud of that just because of the stories that are told in there. So yeah, in retirement, I've done some writing. I teach online at Liberty University and do a couple podcasts like you every once in a while. Somebody calls.
All right. Well, this has been great, and I really have enjoyed you coming on here, sharing just a little bit about your career. Hopefully, you'll come back in the future. We can get into some other areas. You mentioned this book. I'd love to have you back to discuss that book. Where can people go to learn more about you or to to purchase your books? Do you have a website?
Yeah, bobhamer.net. So it's BOBHAMER.net. And there would be links there for the books.
Yes, sir. Bob Hamer, thank you for coming here and talking a little bit about your career in the FBI. I really enjoyed it. Guys watching, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and check out Bob's website, and keep following American Made. I appreciate it.